It would be easy to look at Spain's victory at the 2010 World Cup, as well as their wins at the 2008 and 2012 European Championships, and think that them getting there was just inevitable because of how good their players were. All in the same squad, Spain had the best goalkeeper in the world, two of the best forwards, several elite defenders, and a midfield that was so good that they literally couldn't get all their good players onto the field at once. This team was loaded with talent to the point that it was genuinely a little upsetting, and with that in mind, it's tempting to think that they were just destined for success. But it's also wrong. There's one thing you need to know about the World Cup, it's that there's not always a direct correlation between the teams with the most talent and the teams that do the best. That's true of all sports to a certain extent, but international soccer is a different animal. It takes a very specific formula to have sustained success in major tournaments, and for a significant chunk of their history, it seemed like Spain were just kind of missing some of it. If you don't know much about Spain, you may not realize that the country itself is divided into a series of states called autonomous communities. Now, if you're American like me, you may be sitting there thinking, isn't that kind of like what we have here? To which the answer is, yeah, sort of, but also no. This isn't a centralized group of lowercase s states like we have, so much as it is a looser confederation of capital S states, many of which have their own languages and deeply unique cultural identities. And that's pretty relevant to their international soccer team, because while we've seen from this World Cup that past and present political issues become a part of the conversation pretty regularly, it's not all that often that you see that sort of thing from one team all on its own. Like every country in 2010, Spain brought 23 players to be a part of their World Cup squad. And of those 23 players, 8 of them, so more than a third, came from one of Spain's autonomous communities, even though that area only makes up about 16% of the country's population. Per its size, Catalonia is maybe the greatest producer of elite soccer talent in the entire world, but it's also probably the autonomous community that would most like to become an autonomous country. In September 2009, just a handful of months before the World Cup started, Catalonia held its first referendum on independence from Spain in a small town called Arenys de Munt, in which 96% of its citizens voted in favor of independence. Many more of these referendums followed, and while I don't know if any of the Barcelona players on the team ever actually voted in them, and by all accounts this group of players got along really well, it's gotta be a little awkward if nearly half of your team comes from a place that's actively trying to secede from the rest of your country. Winning a World Cup requires a level of togetherness that is difficult to attain in the best of circumstances, mostly because of the very limited amount of time that these teams have to work together. Which means that for them to be successful, Spain would need to get pretty creative, especially considering everything that was going on at home. It would be a little reductive to say that international soccer is just a structureless free-for-all, but it also wouldn't be completely incorrect relative to the club version of the sport. The lack of time that these international teams have to practice means that their playing styles tend to end up looking a lot more improvised compared to their domestic counterparts. In a real sense, these are pretty much just all-star teams, and as a result, the tactics at that level are typically a little simpler and rely heavily on moments of individual brilliance to get the job done. That's how it's been done for a long time, but at a certain point, Spain were like, hey, we're not that good at this. After a couple of disappointing results at major tournaments, Spain's federation restructured how they set up their entire national team to make it look more like that of a club. All the way down to the youth level, Spain started implementing a coherent, consistent style of play and player for their national squad. And at the top, manager Luis Aragonés started orienting his squad to reflect it too. The style of play became known as Tikitaka, where Spain controlled games by possessing the ball and basically just passing it around teams until they lost their concentration and made a mistake. And it was remarkably successful. By the time the 2008 Euros rolled around, the players on that team, regardless of what part of the country they were from, had been playing that way with each other for a good long while, and it showed. Spain won their first major trophy in 44 years at that tournament, and while that was obviously a big deal, it also created another hurdle for them to overcome in the 2010 World Cup: a whole lot of expectations. If you've watched any of the 2022 version, you'll know that World Cups are tricky things to try and predict, and that doing so is kind of a fool's errand. But if you've got a team in front of you that's just won a major tournament and is basically bringing that entire team back just 2 years later, that seems like a pretty good recipe for success. By all quantitative and qualitative measures, Spain went into the 2010 World Cup with the best chance to win. But we've talked before on this channel about how expectations can absolutely wreck a team's collective concentration, which, ironically, leads them to do the exact opposite of what everyone expected them to in the first place. And that, boys and girls, is what we refer to in the business as foreshadowing. Spain's first game in that World Cup was in the group stage against Switzerland, who, to be fair, were not the easiest opponents to start the tournament off with. But that being said, Spain were still definitely expected to win, and it was definitely still a shock when they didn't. As was their custom, Spain absolutely dominated possession and had 3 times as many shots as the Swiss did, but despite all of their control of the game, one very scruffy goal from defensive midfielder Gelson Fernandez was enough to hand the number 2 ranked team in the world a big fat L. And considering all of the many years of preparation and significant level of resources that Spain had committed to get ready for this specific moment, losing a game before the tournament had even really started was definitely not the way it was supposed to go. Thankfully for them, the World Cup is not a single elimination tournament all the way through, so there was still a chance for Spain to get it together. But up to that point, no team had ever gone on to win the whole thing after losing their first group game. From a psychological perspective, Spain's loss to the Swiss could have had one of 2 possible effects. It could destroy their confidence and cause them to play even worse in their next 2 matches, or it could serve as a wake-up call. And unfortunately for the other members of their group, it was much more the second than the first. Spain's next 2 matches were against Chile and Honduras, which they won pretty comfortably, mostly because their striker, David Villa, decided he was done with the whole not scoring goals thing. After finishing the league season as the highest scoring Spaniard in La Liga, Villa went on an absolute tear in the World Cup, scoring 3 in the group stage and then 2 more in the knockouts, including game winners in both the round of 16 game against Portugal and the quarterfinal against Paraguay. Villa's 5 goals ended up tying him with 3 other players as the World Cup's highest scorer, and in a tournament where Spain only scored 7 goals as a team, it's fair to say that Villa's contribution was pretty invaluable. In a team full of players from Real Madrid and Barcelona, it was the guy from Valencia who ended up making the biggest difference. Hey, wait a second. It says here that he transferred to Barcelona for $40 million before the tournament started. Well, there goes that whole narrative, I guess. And $40 million for a world-class forward? Oh, 2010, you were so quaint. And silly me for thinking that any other team in Spain could have a good player without one of the big 2 inevitably coming to sign him, like a pair of Spanish Death Stars pulling in the Millennium Falcon with their tractor beams. Anyway, where was I? Oh, right. Spain were about to try and win the dang thing. 2 more obstacles stood in Spain's way if they wanted to win their first World Cup in their country's history. A semifinal against a young and stupidly talented Germany team, and potentially the winner of the other semifinal between Uruguay and the Netherlands. This was everything their federation had spent years building up to, but even after all that preparation, all of that meticulous tinkering with Tikitaka, all of those thousands of intricate passes, their World Cup fate was about to be decided by some very timely positioning of a very shaggy head. On a corner kick in the 73rd minute, possibly the last situation you'd expect this Spain team to score a goal from, 5'10" Carlos Puyol leapt through the air like an absolute salmon, or should I say salmon, because of course that's how you say that word, to give the Spaniards a lead that they would not relinquish. The young Germans played well, and 4 years later they'd had their own World Cup moment, but that night belonged to the Spanish, who were headed to their first World Cup final to take on the Netherlands. Like I said at the beginning, I know it seems in hindsight like getting to that point was inevitable because of all the good players they had. But when you consider everything that was going on around this Spanish team, as well as just the nature of tournament soccer, getting to a World Cup final was just so far from guaranteed. Their country was divided, as were the national identities of a decent chunk of their players. But somehow, their team wasn't. They took a huge strategic risk by revamping their national team structure, and then had to road test that revolutionary new setup with the greatest generation of players they'd ever produced. And even when it worked, and the team did have success, they somehow had to then not allow the expectations that came along with that to become an albatross that ruined their shot at the ultimate prize. Viewed through that lens, suddenly everything that Spain's golden generation was able to accomplish becomes even more impressive than it was before. And that very much includes what happened in that game against Holland. Tikitaka wasn't going to be as much of a factor in this one, mostly because the Dutch came out determined to wreck Spain's rhythm, no matter what it took, including engaging in a bit of the dark arts. The game was scoreless after normal time, largely because of a heroic save by Spain's Iker Casillas on Dutch winger Arjen Robben, but in the absence of goals, one thing this game did have was a lot of questionable challenges. One kind of quirky thing about Spain's run to the final in 2010 was that in 3 out of their 7 games, their opponent had one of their players sent off, including this one against the Netherlands. It wasn't Nigel de Jong's chest-high tackle on Xabi Alonso, although in hindsight it probably should have been, but this entire game was chippy, and in the 109th minute, the Dutch finally paid the price for their shithousery when defender Johnny Heitinga was sent off for getting a second yellow card. And just 7 minutes later, deep into extra time of Spain's most important game ever, Andres Iniesta made them pay for it. And that was it. The experiment set out by Luis Aragonés and the rest of the Spanish Soccer Federation had worked. Despite losing their first game, scoring just 7 goals for the entire tournament, and carrying the enormous weight of their country's and the world's expectations the whole way through, Spain had won the most coveted trophy in all of sports. This is the legacy of La Furia Roja, the Red Fury, a team that didn't look like anything anyone had ever seen before at that level, and yet was still able to pull it off. And that legacy lives on, both in the performance of the current iteration of the national team and in the countless other teams that have tried to emulate what they did. But they'll never be able to. Not really, anyway, because what made this team so special was unique to them, both because of the players on their roster and the time those players were playing in. Every great team has characteristics that make them completely distinct, and those characteristics, maybe even more so than the achievements themselves, are what stick with us over time. Spain's golden generation won a whole bunch of stuff, but that was just the what. The who and how were so much more indicative of just how great that team was, and it's what'll carry on in the minds of those who were fortunate enough to watch them. They were impressive on paper, to be sure, but in the imaginations of soccer fans around the world, they were more impressive than anyone could possibly remember. Hello out there to my fellow students. It's Will, and if you're new here, I'm glad you came. This is my channel, Student of the Game, where we talk about sports psychology and culture every 10-ish days or so. If you enjoyed the content, give the video a like and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like it. We're coming up on this channel's 1-year anniversary, which is honestly kind of bonkers to think about, but I've got something pretty special planned to celebrate both that and Christmas and the end of the year in general. Be on the lookout for an announcement about it, because it's something I've never done before on here, and I'm really excited to give it a try. Put your World Cup predictions in the comments, because we've still got a couple of glorious weeks until this thing ends, but for today, that's all we've got for you. See you later.